been consumed, you are left with complex polysaccharides. And so that is cellulose, the body of what makes up most plant material. Cellulose is cross-linked by a very complex molecule called lignin, which provides tremendous amount of strength. This is what makes wood hard. But there's different types of fungi that specialize in digesting cellulose versus lignin. So brown rot fungi are ones that leave this sort of cubical square rot, and they prefer warm conditions and generally acidic conifer wood. And those are consuming, sort of specializing in the hemicellulose, whereas white rot fungi are the ones that digest the lignin, the thing that cross-links the wood. So they end up leaving wood really like shredded. It's very sort of soft and will just pull apart like, shredded chicken kind of thing. And white rot fungi tend to prefer hardwoods and cooler climates, and they can also digest cellulose. White rot fungi are the ones that have a more complex set of like enzymes and more capacity to break down different types of stuff. So in the experiments that have been done of like fungi breaking down, hydrocarbons like oil, it's the white rot fungi that have really excelled at doing that. An interesting note is that for a couple 100 million years worth of life on this planet, white rot fungi had not evolved yet. So plants had evolved lignin, but the thing to break down lignin hadn't evolved. So that's where all of the petrochemicals come from. All of the coal, all of the oil come from that like 100 million year period where none of the plant material was actually getting broken down. So that's part of why it's such a stupid thing that humanity keeps pulling all this oil out of the ground and burning it, because it's never going to get replenished. It will never happen again, because that was this very special period in history where white rot fungi did not exist. But now that we have them, everything is getting turned back into soil and bioavailable nutrients. So it's kind of short-sighted that we continue to pull stuff out of the ground and burn it, knowing that it can never go back. Anyhow, once you're done with the brown rot and the white rot, you get into composters. And this is like fungi that like to mushrooms that grow in like nice, loamy, rich nitrogen soil. And so Agaricus bisporus and shaggy mane are good examples of these things. Shaggy manes are actually a fungi that is nematophagous, so it hunts nematodes with the mycelium, creates little traps to catch nematodes and supplement its nitrogen. So that's sort of the arc of decay. We have a whole bunch of different forms of fungal mutualism, and these are symbioses. Symbiosis can be both parasitic or mutualistic. Just it's things living together. It's neither good nor bad. Symbiosis is just encompassing everything that interacts. So we talked a little bit about lichens as that combination of both an algae or a bacteria with the fungal partner. Turns out that lichens are a lot more complicated too, because the whole microbiome of the lichen, there's a bunch of yeast, there's a bunch of bacteria, there's even stuff like little tardigrades, and that whole complex system is what makes up the lichen as an individual. We have mycorrhizal relationships, which are generally seen in a positive light, but you have to recognize that even mycorrhizal relationships were originally like the fungi was, trying to parasitize the plant, and maybe the plant had like defenses going against the fungi. And over many billions of years, those things have gone from being antagonistic to actually being mutualistic. And that's how a lot of stuff evolves, that a lot of parasitic relationships over a long arc of time become less parasitic and more prone towards mutualism, just because it doesn't benefit you to kill your host. It actually benefits you to like benefit your host so that there's more of the nutrients to go around. There is a lot of fungi involved in the human body. We have yeast all over our skin. We have yeast in our guts. And compared to bacteria, they're a fairly small portion of our microbiome. But like I talked about, the fungi that are present are really important for dictating everyone else that is there. So often when people have imbalances of fungi on their skin or in their guts, they have a lot of downstream problems with the bacteria. And many of the diseases we associate with like, improperly tuned microbiomes might actually be due to an imbalance of the fungi that needs to be corrected, rather than just taking tons of bacterial prebiotics and probiotics. There's endophytes, like I mentioned. So there's fungi that live inside of plants. And these are often acting as sort of the hidden puppeteers of plants. Many of the secondary metabolites in plants that we use as drugs are induced by the production. The production is induced by the presence of fungi and bacteria within that plant, and maybe the way that the interactions are dictating what types of chemistry is going on in the plant. For animals, there's, it's not just us that's in symbiosis with fungi. There's stuff like termites, which have evolved to um, go get wood and cellulose and bring it back to their colony. And then they have particularly this genus of mushrooms called Termitomyces, which digests all the plant matter. And the termites eat the sort of mycelial tissue, and occasionally get these huge mushrooms produced as Termitomyces mushrooms. And there's leafcutter ants, which are one of the most productive partnerships on the entire planet. Similar in that they go out and harvest lots of plant material, bring it back to their nests where the fungi then grows all over it, and they eat the mycelium for nutrients. And the fungi that do that for leafcutter ants rarely, if ever, produce an actual mushroom, and so they're sort of wholly dependent on the plant, on the ants to help them reproduce. Okay, so we talked a little bit about mycorrhizal relationships and how, there's this media bias towards thinking that mycorrhizal relationships are always positive and that they're all somehow altruistic and cooperative. And this was as sort of a smoking of a takedown as you can get from a bunch of scientists, where they said this positive citation bias and overinterpreted results lead to misinformation on common mycorrhizal networks and forests. And so again, that's science language for like not so much, not so fast kind of thing. And that this whole idea that, this is a fully altruistic and happy partnership, and that mycelium is like sharing nutrients across networks of stuff, might want to pull back on that idea a little bit. And instead think about this sort of marketplace economy thing that I mentioned, where each tree is trying to put together a portfolio of fungi that benefits its individual needs, and that the fungi are looking at the nutrients offered by those trees, saying, well, who do we want to actually work for? Who do we want to be associated with? And what I think is kind of cool about this is I was reading applications for the SOMA scholarships. I'm a board member on the Sonoma Mycology Association. We give away 25K every year to support students doing mycology, but I get to read a lot of grant applications. And one of the ones I thought was really fascinating was someone was talking about lactarius mushrooms, milk caps, being sort of like low risk, low reward. So that's why they're associated with so many different tree types, because it doesn't cost a lot to carry one of those. But something like a porcini, a king bolete, is a very high risk, high reward, because it costs a lot of carbon to maintain king boletes on your ectomycorrhizal partnerships. Those king boletes can go out and forage nitrogen for the host tree in a way that the lactarius can't. And so that got me thinking a lot about like, wow, how does the individual tree in a certain habitat choose its collection of fungi? And how does that influence what I'm going to go find while I'm foraging? And how do I like read those types of relationships from an above ground point of view? And I don't know if I can. It's just really cool to think about. And I'm sharing it with you guys because it got me excited. Okay, so fundamentally, there's two basic kinds of mycorrhizae that we care about or should care about. Zygomycetes fungi, or AMF, or buscular mycorrhizal fungi, is associated with about roughly 80% of all the plants on the planet. That accounts for about 55% of the total vegetation cover. And they fix just under 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents yearly. They prefer warmer climates, nutrient-rich soil, and they're common in like grasslands, agriculture, and deciduous forests. But they don't produce mushrooms, just big spores you can see in the soil. And so they tend to be associated with a lot of like species richness, but they're not mushroom producing. So again, we don't care about them as much. We should care about them more. But again, I'm a forager. So I like mushrooms. I like things that produce something I can eat. So in temperate areas and up into boreal forests and stuff like that, you tend to get a lot more mycorrhizal relationships. My cat's come along here. Hi, buddy. Okay, hang on. I'm giving a talk, but you can sit on my lap. Okay. So ECM fungi are the ectomycorrhizal ones, and that's associated with only like 1 to 2% of the plants on the planet, but it still accounts for about 25% of the vegetation cover, because they're associated with those big boreal forests that cover, Alaska and Canada and Siberia and stuff like that. So they're really important for nitrogen fixation, because the ectomycorrhizal fungi tend to produce networks of mycelium that go out a lot further and live a lot longer. So they sink a lot more carbon into the soil in those big boreal forests. And that's part of why like global warming is so scary, because it's changing those dynamics, and a lot of that carbon that is sunk into the Arctic is now coming up to the surface and getting released as gases. But the ECM fungi are fixing about 9 gigatons of CO2 equivalents every year, and they prefer these cooler climates and nutrient poor soil where the trees really need these ECM fungi to go out and forage nutrients for them. But they are producing mushrooms, so we care more about them. But again, this is sort of, thinking about mycorrhizal relationships there's a lot more complexity there than saying that mycelium is the internet of nature, right? And I just kind of want to show you guys some of those factors. So this is somewhat I talk about in the book and try to explain in the simplest way possible, even though it is kind of a complex subject. So thank you for sticking with me through this. Here's some different types of fungal parasitism. So we have a reishi mushroom here, Ganoderma. Reishi can grow on the same tree for many, many years without killing the tree host. So this is what's known as a biotroph, a type of parasite that doesn't kill the host. It's on a live host, a biotroph. Whereas you have honey mushrooms, which are very aggressive plant pathogens, and those tend to kill trees. They use weaponized mycelium called rhizomorphs to sneak up in between the bark and the cambium, the living layer of tissue under the bark, and they girdle the tree. So they cut off the flow of the nutrients through the xylem and the phloem, and then kill and eat the tree, basically. So that's what's known as a necrotroph. There are lobster mushrooms, which is a base mushroom, Russell brevipes, that gets colonized by an Ascomycete mold, which completely parasitically castrates the ability of mushrooms' ability to make spores, and the entire surface of this lobster mushroom just becomes a spore production factory for the hypomyces, and that's what that sort of like white sheen on that mushroom is. And so this is Ascomycete on Basidiomycete crime, as I like to call it, because you get an Asco mold on a Basidiomycete mushroom. Shrimp of the woods, which I don't get here in California, but I've seen out east. I assume maybe you guys get it in Texas, is a combination of Armillaria being parasitized by Entoloma. And so this is like a Basidio on Basidio crime because it's two Basidiomycetes interacting to produce these weird fleshy galls, which are pretty tasty. I like shrimp of the woods. Then we have entomopathogenic fungi. So this is fungi that are preying on insects. I talked about that earlier with Amasispora. So here's Cordyceps militaris, which is the most common cordyceps that we see in North America. Down in South America, there's a lot more diversity of cordyceps that parasitize very specific insect species. But here in North America, Cordyceps militaris is sort of our predominant one that infects like over 50 different insect species. So it's sort of a generalist, whereas many cordyceps are specialists. We have another entomopathogenic fungi called Gibellula, which specifically targets arachnids. It's in the cordyceps family, but it looks a little bit different, and it's genetically keyed in to eat spiders. And then we have weird stuff like the cedar apple rust and corn smut. So cedar apple rust it's very boring looking on an apple tree. It infects the leaves and creates sort of little hairs on the, if you have an apple tree and you have little yellow spots on leaves, turn the leaf over, you'll see these little hairs. That's cedar apple rust. And it spends I think 2 years of its life cycle on apples. And then it jumps over to a cedar or a juniper where it infects, spends about 3 years there. So it's this 5-year life cycle. And it turns the little cedar things into these crazy floppy orange jelly Muppet looking things, which are really wild. And there's corn smut, which is a plant pathogen. And in Mexico, it's known as huitlacoche, and it's a traditional food. And it's really amazing because it makes corn sort of more nutritious and more delicious. But here in the United States, we see it as a plant pathogen. So we spray tons and tons of fungicides on our cornfields to try to make this thing not happen. And I think it's really fascinating because it's we could harness the potential of fungi as this amazing food source, but instead we spray all this stuff to prevent this thing from happening because we see it as a negative thing instead of trying to understand that maybe fungi could be helping us out. So just, different flavors of, is it a parasite? Is it a food? It kind of, it's eye of the beholder kind of thing, Okay, so looking at how to categorize mushrooms, traditionally they've been defined based on their morphology, the way they look. And this makes a lot of sense because throughout most of recorded history, all we could do was look at stuff. We didn't necessarily have molecular tools like DNA sequencing. We just had to kind of observe something and draw conclusions based on the way it looked. So morphology is still a very useful way to categorize and understand mushrooms. And I like this breakdown here because it kind of gives you a little bit of like a flow chart on deciding, are you looking at something above ground or below ground? Are you looking at like an Ascomycete or Basidiomycete? And then what kind of morphological category does this stuff fall into? Does it have gills? Does it have pores? Is it little ridges? What are we looking at? In my book, I'll show you just my illustration real quick. Um, do, 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 do. One more page. There we go. All right. So here's my category of like 16 different kind of morphological types. Um, and that's how I sort of tried to, as much as I could, break down all of mushrooms into some basic archetypes that you can help like bin out your finds. And this little flow chart is a very like helpful way of doing that. So it helps to learn morphology, even though it may not be the end all way to define mushrooms, because in more modern times, we've gotten access to DNA sequencing. And DNA sequencing is much better at helping us trace evolutionary relationships. And that's important because in the world of fungi, there's a lot of what's called convergent evolution. So gills have evolved multiple times, pores have evolved multiple times, teeth have evolved multiple times, which says that not all tooth mushrooms are actually related. Not all gilled mushrooms are related. Not all, mushrooms with pores are related. In fact, things can be wildly different from each other, stemming from completely different lineages that have converged on a similar looking morphology or phenotype, even though genetically they're completely different backgrounds. And so DNA sequencing has allowed us to kind of reorganize and completely reimagine and understand the fungal kingdom from a very different perspective, because we have these molecular tools. And I love it, but it's also really confusing because a lot of people don't necessarily understand sequencing, or like, why have so many names changed recently? Or I learned mushrooms 20 years ago and now all the names are different, because these genetic relationships have kind of come to dominate our traditional way of looking at stuff through morphology. But there's value in both approaches, and I try to sort of address both in my book to the best of my abilities, in hopefully an understandable and accessible kind of way. So if you're still here, thank you for putting up with all of the science. I really appreciate it. I'm a PhD biochemist and I'm passionate about this stuff, but I recognize that not everybody cares about all the science. So good on you for sticking through it. I am now going to show you a bunch of pretty pictures. So mushrooms can grow everywhere. And I think that's really neat because they can grow on the ground, they can grow on wood, they can grow on other mushrooms. These are little things called powder caps, which, parasitize like a blown out dead brittle russula kind of mushroom. They can grow on animals like this cordyceps here, taking my friend Damon Ty. They can grow in like warm tropical climates, like these little Kukiania, the tropical bristlecups. They can grow in really cold climates, like these Enoki Flammulina mushrooms. There's even ones that can grow in the desert that specialize in growing like sandy soil where it's super dry. There's these things called desert truffles, which don't taste like a black truffle, but apparently they're kind of like sweet and nutty and a little bit like potato-like. And there's places where they're trying to cultivate those, and I really want to eat one of those. That's definitely on my bucket list. And hell, there's even mushrooms that grow underwater. There's a lot of underwater fungi, but there's not a lot of underwater mushrooms. And this is Satharella aquatica, which is the first underwater documented Basidiomycete mushroom, and it was found in the Rogue River. And we thought, oh, what a cool little kind of biological oddity. And then it turned out that someone found the same mushroom down in LA, like several thousand miles south. And they're like, okay, well, that extends the range of this mushroom by a lot. And then this summer, I gave a talk in Pennsylvania at MycoFest, and I mentioned this, and someone's like, oh, yeah, someone here just found, the same kind of mushroom in a river here in Pennsylvania. And I was like, oh my God, maybe there's underwater mushrooms everywhere. We just haven't been looking for them or understanding them. And so this is part of why we continue to discover new species and new ways of living, because mushroom hunters tend to go where mushroom hunters think that mushrooms are going to be. But it turns out when we start looking at other places and paying attention to like little microclimates and habitats, that we find stuff living there that we weren't necessarily aware of before. And that's part of why there's so much sort of dark matter in the unknown fungal universe that we're still discovering. So there's a lot of cool ways that mushrooms can grow. They can form fairy rings, which I hate to tell you is not a portal to another dimension. It is not the Fey realm. It is just a big patch of mycelium growing in a circle. And the mushrooms tend to fruit around the edge of the patch because they are trying to grow outward and expand the patch of mycelium, because it's growing each year. Usually in the middle of a fairy ring, you'll actually see really, really green, vibrant grass in the very middle of the fairy ring, because that's where the mycelium has started to decompose and is actually adding nutrients back to the soil. So the grass looks super extra happy in the middle of the fairy ring. Um, you have gravitropism, where fungi will reorient based on gravity because they always want to grow, so their spores are facing down. Uh, and as I say that, there's also this phenomenon known as rose combing, where spores will somehow grow on the top of a mushroom, defying the laws of gravitropism. And you can even see double-decker mushrooms growing in really extreme cases of rose combing. There are rhizomorphs, like I talked about. These are the sort of like weaponized, evil-looking cousins of mycelium that honey mushrooms use to creep up and kill trees. They're full of melanin to help them survive being exposed to the elements. They can crawl and actually go for like, a quarter of a mile, several hundred feet above ground and like creep up behind a tree. Um, and there's sclerotia, which is not technically a mushroom. If anyone's familiar with this is chaga, which is a sterile conch and is not a mushroom. So anyone who says chaga mushroom is fundamentally misunderstanding what chaga is. Sclerotia is a way that fungi will store nutrients. Imagine almost like a mushroom potato, where it's like a tuber that's full of melanin and other compounds to help it kind of resist getting rotted out or attacked by other stuff. But it's storing a lot of carbohydrates and lipids so that when the mushroom is ready to form, it can draw on all its resources in the sclerotia to form mushrooms. That's really fundamental for even how morels form. Morels have to form a sclerotia to then form a fruiting body later. But that's a whole different talk. And if you learn more about that, I would suggest you check out Trad Cotter, who I've learned a lot from at Telluride Mushroom Festival. And there's also like tons of really, really tiny mushrooms that are like so infinitesimally small. We can argue back and forth about whether or not this counts as a mushroom or a mold or whatever. And then there's some really massive mushrooms. So this is not like a photoshopped or doctored photo. This is a real, Mexican mycologist. I don't think he's a tall dude. He might have been like 5'4", but that is a very large mushroom. That's what's known as a roundhead or macrocide titans, which can grow to just absolutely ginormous size. And it's a saprotroph. So I'd really like to see some cultivators start to get that into culture and try to grow macrocide, because they can get as big as an umbrella and like they're edible. So why not grow those? Wouldn't you want to go to farmer's market and come home with a mushroom that could protect you from the rain? I'm pretty sure that when it occurs in Texas, at least it's in Florida, if not elsewhere on the Gulf Coast. So if there's any cultivators out there, go find some macrocide and try to get that going in your setup. So there's a lot of different spore spreading strategies that mushrooms have. One of the main ones is to recruit animals to come mess around with a mushroom. We think of mushrooms, generally it's a cap and a stem mushroom, and everyone's kind of familiar with spores falling from the gills and being blown around by the wind. That is a great way to get your spores out there. But for many mushrooms, they want to be a little bit more active about it. So they're recruiting animals to come help spread the spores for them. And that's what stinkhorns do. Stinkhorns actively smell absolutely terrible so that flies will come crawl all over them and get coated in this sticky substance called gleba, which is the sort of the black goo that's on a stinkhorn, and it smells to high heaven, but it's full of spores. So flies crawl around in that, and then they go out and find a little pile of poo, crawl around in that, and the spores get transferred to the poo. Now the spores have access to nitrogen, so they germinate, produce mycelium, and start the whole life cycle over again. Another thing that is known for smelling is truffles. So truffles are not a genetic category. Truffles are actually like more of a lifestyle. Every major family and lineage of fungi has a truffle form because it's useful. And basic truffles evolve to live underground. And so they're shielded from environmental, changes. It doesn't matter if it rains or not. They're underground, so they have moisture. But what do you do if you're underground? You can't spread your spores via wind. So all truffles have essentially evolved the ability to be stinky, which motivates animals to dig them up. And traditionally, we think of pigs doing this, but most modern truffle hunting is actually done with dogs. And when we look at the vectors for the way that the spores of truffles are spread around, it's more due to insects and like small rodents and birds that are digging them up and spreading those spores around than something like a pig. There's also slugs and lots of different little gastropod things that come along and eat the gills and the spores of mushrooms, because that's where a lot of the nutrients are loaded in there. And a lot of spores can survive going through the digestive tract of a slug and then they get pooped out in nice habitat where they germinate and again keep growing mycelium. There's also fungi that are using sort of mechanical distribution to get their spores out there. So this little orange thing here is the cannonball fungus, and it's super common in like wood chip beds. It's very, very tiny, but it essentially builds up a whole bunch of pressure inside of this little globule and shoots that little white thing called a peridiole about 10 to 15 feet away. And this is the equivalent of like a human being lifting up a table and throwing it about a half a mile in the air in terms of the amount of force that it's creating. So cannonball fungi are remarkable, but generally homeowners don't like them because they're down in the wood chips and they're ruining the siding on houses and stuff like that. But you also have stuff like an earth star, or a puffball where there's a whole bunch of spores inside of this. Sorry, cat is doing stuff inside of this sort of container. And when the droplets of rain come and hit the little container, then the spores come out. And so that's mechanical distribution. You also have bird nest fungi, little cups full of those kind of peridial egg-like things. And when a water droplet splashes in, it splashes out. So there's a whole bunch of different modes for spore dispersal. And then one of my favorites is something called deliquescence, when ink cap mushrooms will physically and literally melt to disperse their spores. So I have a little time-lapse video of this. So this is about probably 18 to 20 hours time lapse of this mushroom turning up, and it's turning literally into black goo. It's deliquescing. And so you can use that black goo as a substitute for squid ink in a pasta dish, or you can even mix it with alcohol and turn it into an ink. That's why traditionally they're called ink caps, because people would mix them with alcohol and use them for drawing, painting, that kind of thing. So here's a whole bunch of different like ways of spore dispersal. And that's also one of the main things that has driven the evolution of different mushroom families and different mushroom forms, is different strategies to disperse spores. So here's some top tier edible wild mushrooms. A lot of these are here from California, but you can find versions of them all over the United States, probably including Texas, although I don't know how common they are down there. So here's the official California state mushroom, Cantharellus californicus. I went to a Senate committee a couple years ago and encouraged them to adopt this as our official state mushroom, and they ratified it, verified it while I was there. So that's one I'm proud of. But chanterelles are delicious edible mushrooms. There's also king boletes or porcini. I was talking about those earlier with like there being sort of a high risk, high reward one for a tree, but they're utterly delicious edible mushrooms. So the one we have here in California is Boletus edulis var grand edulis that grows with our pine trees. There are hedgehog mushrooms, which are great for beginners because they have little teeth underneath and they're kind of pinky and orangey, and they're usually pretty easy to identify because of that. We have black trumpets, which I just found a couple of last week. They're really, really tasty mushrooms. They're craterellus. And those are, hedgehogs and black trumpets are great for beginners because they're virtually impossible to misidentify. It makes them really safe for people who want to get into foraging. Also, usually here in California in the winter, there tends to be a lot of them out on the coast, which is wonderful. There's lion's mane or hericium. There's several different species of hericium, but lion's mane are like absolutely delicious mushrooms that can be cultivated commercially too. So most of these other mushrooms cannot be cultivated commercially, but lion's mane can be. So I highly recommend trying that one. If you've never liked eating mushrooms because they're slimy or taste too earthy, try lion's mane. It has sort of a seafood-like texture and a very mild flavor, which is very, very good and different from other mushrooms. There's chicken of the woods, which I get a lot of here in Napa. And I think I know there's chicken of the woods that grow in Texas. And these are sort of top tier edible mushrooms, although chicken of the woods does have a reputation because about 1 in 10, 1 in 20 people are allergic to it, and it can cause you to both throw up and have diarrhea at the same time, which is not so great. So if you do find and want to eat chicken of the woods, my recommendation is to cook it very, very well and start it with just a small piece. Like, eat some, wait an hour or two, see how you feel. If you have any tummy rumbles, maybe don't eat a lot more. You hear about the bad experiences with chicken of the woods where someone finds it, gets so excited, and then they eat like 2 or 3 pounds of it, and then they spend the night switching back and forth, which end that stuff is coming out of. So be careful with chicken of the woods. Even though it's really easy to identify, it can cause some GI upset. There's cauliflower mushrooms, Parassus, which is top tier favorite edible mushroom for me. makes a great like noodle substitute in a pasta dish. And there's black and blonde morels, which are universally some of the most kind of desired edible mushrooms that are out there, and those tend to fruit out in spring. So these are all great edible mushrooms. I'd highly recommend you try. And even if you can't find them around you, you can probably buy them from a specialty mushroom vendor, someplace like Far West Fungi will ship them to you, and they're utterly delicious, and you should give them a shot. So here's some poisonous mushrooms. Poisonous mushrooms get an undue amount of attention, right? I like to think that maybe there's like 40 to 50,000 species of mushrooms out there. Probably about 2% of those are good edibles, and maybe about 2% of them are toxic. And everything in between is just a mushroom. So when we talk about edibility, it's not a binary yes or no. There's a lot of kind of like mix and match about what is edible, what is not edible. But some things are definitively toxic because they can poison you. So the classic example is the fly agaric Amanita muscaria, which is confusing because muscaria is actually a edible, toxic, and trippy mushroom all at the same time, depending on how you process it. But it's sort of the most recognizable, most iconic mushroom, and everyone knows it when they see it. They know it's a mushroom. They're like, that's the Mario mushroom, right? So it's fairly brightly colored, but I want to point out that all of the other poisonous mushrooms here are kind of drab, and that's a big thing because people assume that if it's brightly colored, it must be poisonous. And other than Amanita muscaria, most poisonous mushrooms are not very colorful. Most of them are like, brown or white or some version of that. But muscaria can be turned into an edible mushroom if you boil it in two successive changes of water. You can dilute out the toxin and then just cook it like an edible mushroom. You can dry it out and turn it into an entheogenic tea, where if you boil it down with a little bit of lemon juice, you will drink it. And some people use it for sleep or pain killing. Technically, muscimol, the active component, is a GABA agonist, so it acts a lot like alcohol in our bodies, but it does not function like psilocybin in magic mushrooms. So it's a fundamentally different type of chemistry. And recently, the FDA just put out a big recall on any edible products containing Amanita muscaria or muscimol because there was some deaths associated with earlier this summer of these unregulated supplement things. So certainly be really careful if you have any edible products or tinctures with Amanita muscaria, because there has been no laws or standards for labeling. And I don't think Amanita muscaria is inherently that dangerous of a mushroom, but if there's no regulations on how it's used or what it goes into, that's when problems occur. And if you were to eat Amanita muscaria raw, you would poison yourself pretty badly. So don't do that. Unlike Amanita muscaria, which can be processed to be made safe, the Destroying Angel and the Death Cap mushrooms are in section Phalloideae in Amanita, and they contain the deadly toxin, little circular peptides called amatoxins. And amatoxins will go through your system and then bind to proteins in your liver and shut down all your liver function. And so you get sick like 12 to 24 hours after eating the mushroom. Then you get slightly better, and then over like 7 to 10 days, your body is essentially liquefying and stopping all of its bodily functions because your liver is shut down. So it's a very painful, very horrific way to die. And every year, there's people here in California who end up eating death caps and getting poisoned by them. There was just a story in the news about it. So it's really important to teach people about what death caps and destroying angels look like, and the different types of amanitas. A lot of beginner mushroom foragers should just avoid amanitas entirely, but there are some excellent edible amanitas, and there's also just some cool ones. So I think it's worthwhile to teach and educate them instead of just ignoring them or sort of, saying, let's not touch these at all. Also, to that point, all of these toxic mushrooms are perfectly safe to touch. The toxins, the amatoxins, and other types of toxins in mushrooms don't diffuse across skin. So you can touch them all you want. I wouldn't necessarily recommend like licking your fingers afterwards, but you can safely touch them. Just don't eat them and don't ingest them, because that's where you can get poisoned. So funeral bells, Galerina, also contain amatoxins. There's little small brown mushrooms that grow on wood, aren't usually ones that people are collecting as food, but they can be mistaken for magic mushrooms, psilocybe mushrooms. And so that's part of why I have them on the slide. Do not confuse Galerina with psilocybes, otherwise you'll have a very bad time. Roll rims are one that I guess mycologists used to eat them in Europe. And then more recently, people have realized that they can cause sort of like a weird autoimmune blood condition, which can be fatal. So don't eat roll rims. It's probably best to avoid that. Jack-o'-lanterns, Omphallotus, You guys get the much brighter orange illudins, which can be a lookalike for chanterelles. So it's again good to familiarize yourself with like the ridges under a chanterelle versus like true gills. So the blade-like, page-like gills versus little ridges. And jack-o'-lanterns are really cool because they glow in the dark. They bioluminesce, and they can also be used to dye fabric. So they do have some interesting uses, but more often than not, you hear them in the news about people poisoning themselves with jack-o'-lanterns. And if you've ever seen the movie Phantom Thread, about like a fashion designer who gets all worked up into a tizzy, and he has like a woman in his life who literally feeds him poisonous mushrooms to kind of slow him down. That's what she's feeding him. In the movie, they used oyster mushrooms that were spray painted orange, but it was close enough to looking like a jack lantern. Then there is, I hate the name false morel, but that's what most people call them. In my book, I called them lorchels. It's an old German name, but Geromitra contain monomethylhydrazine, which is a fairly potent neurotoxin that can cause deaths or just severe poisoning symptoms. So it's good to know the difference between morels versus the Geromitra. And there's Satan's bolete, which is the one truly toxic kind of bolete. And the toxins in Satan boletes are also heat stable proteins. So much like the destroying angel and the death cap, there's no amount of cooking you can do to make these safe. And in general, boletes are very safe and they're almost all edible except for rubroboletus. So it pays to recognize the morphological characteristics of rubroboletus and that it has the red pores that stain blue and a lot of reticulation on the stem there. So talking about, the toxic mushrooms are kind of drab. Here's some really vividly colorful mushrooms. None of these are toxic. In fact, most of them are probably edible. And I think that's an important point to make too, because again, people just constantly have that misunderstanding that colorful equals toxic. And that's just not true for mushrooms and fungi. But I do think that they're super beautiful and they're worth documenting because they're sort of stunning things to look at. This blue one is Entoloma horscheteri, and it's the national mushroom of New Zealand. It's on their currency. All the mushrooms in this top line are from my friend Lee Ormsby, and I would highly recommend giving her a follow if you're interested in seeing colorful mushrooms and cool stuff from New Zealand. That was where I kind of cut my teeth on originally on being into mushrooms, and so I have a desire to go back there someday because I never found this blue mushroom in New Zealand, and gosh, I want to. But here's some beautiful little like red mycena, some kind of waxy cap hygrosabe, this cool purple mushroom. It's a Cortinarius. This is what's called a sequoioid mushroom. So it's halfway into evolving into a truffle. It doesn't, its gills never open up and display. Instead, the gills are sort of protected inside the cap as it's all folded in. And you'd say, well, how do the spores get out then if it never opens up? So the prevailing theory on this is that this big purple thing kind of looks like a piece of fruit on the ground. And there used to be big birds that were kind of equivalent to like a cassowary or an ostrich living in New Zealand. And they would go around and probably eat these mushrooms off the ground and then poop them out. So this purple Cortinarius has evolved to be eaten by a bird to help it move its spores around. Unfortunately, that bird is no longer around, but the mushroom is still around. Although I bet you the range of that mushroom is significantly less than it was when there was an animal that would eat it and poop its spores out. So kind of a cool evolutionary thing that's left around. Here's some really pretty purple Ramaria coral fungi. Here's a little green Lactarius that'll grow up and get kind of orangey, and then as it ages out, it'll go turn green again. Very pretty little hygrosabe from Vermont. And then this is the Neo albatrellus, little blue polypore. This is one of the sort of rare mushrooms that occurs here on the West Coast. And there's a great rare mushroom survey through Fundus you can look up, and it's fun to go out and try to find the rare mushrooms of your region. I believe there's one for the Southeast that might overlap with Texas a little bit. So check out the Fungal Diversity Survey and their rare mushroom surveys in case you want to get involved and do some citizen science yourself. So there are UV reactive and bioluminescent mushrooms out there. Hypholoma are these gorgeous sort of like highlighter yellow mushrooms. They glow really nice. Leptonias, Entolomas are really blue. Hemimycenas glow super bright. So these are things where you're inputting light and exciting electrons. And when those electrons come down in energy state, they put out a different color of light. So that's fluorescence versus bioluminescence, where the mushrooms themselves are making light all the time. And they're not producing different wavelengths. They're only making this green color, but they're making light through this chemical reaction of luciferin and luciferase, kind of similar to the way that jellyfish, glow underwater. These are really beautiful. Most bioluminescent mushrooms are not bright enough to see with the naked eye, so you kind of have to do a long exposure. But Pinellus dipticus and jack-o'-lanterns omphalotus are bright enough, and if you want to see them, you can go play like 7 Minutes in Heaven with a mushroom in a closet in the middle of your house. Just get completely black out, and you'll see it glow green after about 5-10 minutes once your eyes adjust. There's some notable mushroom aromas, things that smell really great. So candy cap, Lactaris rubidus is one we get out here on the West Coast. It smells like maple. It literally contains the same compound that's in maple syrup, that's in sherry, that's in fenugreek. It's a compound called sotalon. It's a lactone that has a super long residency time. So candy caps just get better and better smelling years and years after you've dried them out. The Prince is a kind of portobello looking mushroom, but has this nice almondy character. It has benzaldehyde, the same compound that's in almonds that make them smell like almonds. Matsutake have this sort of spicy seafood like smell, which is great in Asian dishes. Bluets have this sort of frozen orange juice concentrate smell that if you've ever had cafeteria orange juice, you know what a bluet smells like. Here in California, we get the cedar waxy cap, which is said to smell like Russian leather, sort of very like terpenic, very piney. It's one of my favorite smelling mushrooms. I found some in the woods last week and I poured a bunch of vodka over them to see if I could kind of get that smell into solution. There's the blue-green Clitosobe colibia that smells like anise or fennel. A lot of oyster mushrooms smell kind of similar. And we have some really stinky mushrooms, like this little putrid, stinky squid mushroom that is literally one of the worst smelling things. It's super small, but every time I find it, I'm like, oh my God, is there a dead body? Like, what is that? Turns out it's just this little stinkhorn. And then you have the yellow stainer, Agaricus xanthoderma as the sort of species group. David Aurora calls them part of the lose your lunch bunch. But basically, if you eat them, you will throw up quite a bit. But they stain yellow and they have this really strong like phenol, like Band-Aid, disinfectant, library paste kind of smell. So it's important to like pick up mushrooms and smell them because it can help you with identification, helps train your brain. And there's just so many cool mushroom textures out there. I love getting a little macro lens on my phone and jamming them up into mushrooms and trying to capture all that complexity of texture you can see there. So some of my favorite stuff to take pictures of. And then one of my favorite phenomenon is just guttation, little droplets that are produced when mushrooms are growing quickly. Mushrooms are like us in that they sweat because they're producing carbon dioxide and water when they grow. So it manifests these little droplets full of polyphenols and tannins and things that give them color and make for some truly stunning photography. And biologically, what we think is going on is that these mushrooms are going to grow and continue to mature for quite a while. But in this like nascent state, they're very tender and very vulnerable. So maybe the guttation is often kind of bitter or loaded with other organic acids that might deter insects from trying to snack on the mushroom. There's also microheterotrophic plants that are not fungi, but they associate with the roots, with the mycelium of fungi, where they're drawing carbon out from the mycelium. And traditionally, they always thought of being parasites on the mycelium, but we're realizing more and more as time goes on that where you have trees and microheterotrophs and fungi, that you actually have increased density of fungi and driven by certain types of like diversity of fungi that are associated with these microheterotrophic plants. So maybe these microheterotrophs are actually important parts of the forest ecosystem and not just like parasites. But it is pretty cool to find them because they're super otherworldly looking. They don't do photosynthesis, so there's no green part. It's all just a vibrant, crazy looking flower thing that comes up once a year. But there's no green leaves, and I love that. And all orchids at some point in their lives are microheterotrophic because orchid seeds don't actually have any like wheat or germ inside them. There's no nutrition. So an orchid seed puts out a chemical signal that gets a mycorrhizal fungi to come and associate it with it, and the orchid hijacks the nutrition from the fungi to help it form a flower. So that's part of why it's so hard to cultivate orchids in culture, because you need to have a fungal partner. And there's slime molds, which do really cool stuff. They're not fungi, they're more like amoebas. But I'll show you some like pulsing. This is what happens when you time lapse slime molds, is they do crazy kind of pulsing. So I took some of these time lapse videos in my backyard, just out at local parks. But you can kind of see that Plasmodium like pulsing and crawling and doing cool stuff. So I have a lot more videos of that on my Instagram there. And they form pretty distinctive structures called sporangia, and that's what the photos of this stuff is. It's all the different types of sporangia you see. So I think I'm running a little late here, so I'm going to skip past the next couple of slides. But this is all about, using mushrooms and fungi in future directions and all the kind of cool stuff you can do with them. You can, get better soils. You can make micromaterials. You can produce enzymes for laundry detergent, medicines, all sorts of stuff. Lots of drugs and therapeutics have been derived from fungi, and that's really important for modern medicine. There's lots of different ways to grow mushrooms, and that's great. And again, there's slides and more info on this in my book. Different ways to cultivate mushrooms, and a lot of cool, like interesting things happening with mycomaterials and producing fibers and construction materials, as well as sustainable protein, using fungi as a way to kind of drive ourselves forward towards a sustainable future with their help. And also community science. There's a lot of ways to get involved in helping fungi. And I think a lot of stuff in humanity is like, what can the world do for us? And I'm constantly trying to get people to say, well, hey, mushrooms have already done so much for us. Maybe we should ask, instead of what can mushrooms do for us, we should say, what can we do for mushrooms? And one of the main ways to do that is to get involved in community science projects where we're helping to do biodiversity surveys. You're going out on hikes with the Central Texas Mycological Society and helping them understand the fungi that are around. You're doing DNA sequencing, and you're learning from this whole community of people that are sort of partnering with academia and bringing this sort of citizen community science thing to a front, through stuff like the Fungal Diversity Survey, Mycota Labs, et cetera. So there's lots of cool people doing that kind of stuff. And I have a book coming out. So please check out Passport to Kingdom Fungi. The link to pre-order is on my website, and you can find it at any major book retailer. It's a cool book. It's like I said, it's pretty surreal to like have put all this work into it and be holding this physical copy of it. But I keep going back to it and referencing things in the book that I wrote, because I can't keep everything in my brain, but I downloaded my brain into a book. So if you've ever had a question for me, the answer is probably in here. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Amazing. Yay. Clap, 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 clap. That was so good.
Thanks.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that it'll be a good time to do the book giveaway, and then we can do some questions. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
So I did a random number generator, and Courtney Myers is the lucky winner. So Courtney, I'll just need your physical or your mailing address. And so I'm going to just DM you the email. If you can just send me your mailing address, we'll get that out to you. But yeah, it's very exciting. The DNA thing is something we're very excited about. We just kicked off, and actually in the morning, I'm going to be going over to the Austin Community College. We're partnering up with them to do DNA barcoding. So it's very exciting. We'll start to develop some programming around that to engage everyone else and teach everyone else how to help us do collections and hopefully discover some new species here in Texas. So yeah, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. There was one question that came up, or a couple actually. Let's see. So Laura asked, does fungi does the poison in poisonous mushrooms affect all animals? And does the poison have any effect besides protecting the mushroom?
Okay, that's a great question. There's a thing in my book where I tried to kind of get a handle on all the different kinds of poisons in mushrooms. There's a big old table on all the different like categories of toxins that are in mushrooms. And I'll say this, we don't necessarily know every single toxin in mushrooms. There's the main ones like amatoxins that we understand fairly well because they've been studied. And the quick answer is no, the toxins don't affect all animals equally. The purpose, I think, in general of having toxins in a mushroom is to deter animals from eating the mushroom itself. But some of those toxins may also be present for like interfungal communication or like, competition. But in general, like if you see an animal eating a mushroom, that does not mean it's safe for a human to eat that mushroom. Right? We have fundamentally different physiology, metabolism, than a squirrel or a bird or an insect. So just because you see an animal eating something doesn't mean it's safe. It's also, if you see an animal eating a mushroom, that animal might go off and die somewhere else, but you're not seeing that. So, we can't trust animal behavior as a reliable guide for what we can or can't eat. And in general, when I talk to people about like mushrooms, I encourage them rather than saying, "Hey, can I eat this mushroom?" I say, "Hey, why don't you ask me like, what is this mushroom?" Let's start it
Mhm.
with a dialogue about what something is, because if you can get a name attached to it, then you can go ahead and like do a series of your own investigations and research to try to make the personal decision whether or not this is something you want to eat. Like I talked about, chicken of the woods is a really easy to identify mushroom, but about 1 in 10, 1 in 20 people is allergic to it and they'll throw up if they eat it. So it's still your personal responsibility if you decide to eat a mushroom. Don't just ask someone else on the internet, can I eat this? Say, hey, just tell me what this is, and I'll do my own line of investigation. And ideally, also get multiple points of reference to figure out whether or not it's something you want to eat. But don't rely on an animal to tell you whether or not you want to eat something.
Yes, yes. And I found some of our southern jack-o'-lanterns the other day and did my first time lapse to do, or did my first long exposure
Long
to
exposure. Yeah. Yeah.
bioluminescence, but that one specifically had nice bites taken out of it. And we've had multiple poisonings in this area because it's so confused with the chanterelle, even though it has completely different ecology, different roles. Um, so yeah, it was a good a picture of that with a big bite taken out of it was also showing the bioluminescence. Plus, like, just because it has a bite taken out of it doesn't mean
Right.
it's edible.
Right. And that's
um,
that's an important one too, where also like if you read a description of a jack-o'-lantern, it sounds like a chanterelle. If you see
mhm,
pictures of them side by side, they look very different, and it's harder to confuse them if you have the visual comparison. But if you're
mhm,
just reading the text, they sound so similar that that's part of why, people also get really excited and just want jack-o'-lanterns to be chanterelles, and that's they just eat something without the proper
mhm.
level of care and attention because they're excited. And so it's again, I always encourage people, you're going to find edible mushrooms. It's good to find them a couple of times before you go ahead and eat them. You want to find them in the same spot over multiple seasons to be like, this is what I think it is. And I've gotten a bunch of different corroborations to say that this is edible and not, the poisonous one. So it's always a good idea to take it slow rather than do something and make a mistake.
Yes. So I have a question, and it's around the spore dispersal strategies. So as you're as you may be familiar with our state mushroom, it's an Ascomycetes. It's the only mushroom in the genus. And I found a few things online about how they spread their spores. And a lot of people, they're fascinated by the fact that you can hear the spores dispersing with the hissing
Yeah.
sound.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your take. And I've seen a few, I think on MycoWeb, there was like describing the spore dispersal as like spore guns, which I was like, okay, well, that's right up the alley of like the Texas state mushroom.
Yep.
Um, but I'm curious to hear your explanation of like how we're able to hear the spores. Is it the size of them?
Ooh.
Is it and I know I might be putting you on the spot because this is like a
So I mean, what I can say is, and let me see, I have a slide here. Do slide here on lichens.
mhm,
So a lot of lichens are ascomycetes. So they
mhm,
form a little cup, and that little cup, like here is essentially analogous to like a cup fungi. Your Texas Earth Star thing is essentially a cup fungi that opens up, and that whole inner brown surface is the hymenium, which is equivalent to like the gills of a basidiomycete mushroom. So it's covered in lots of little. So I'm going to go way back here to the ASCO and Basidio slide. Uh, Sorry, I just want to have a visual when I talk about this, and so I can think about it from my own head. Um, do, do, do. I have a couple versions of this talk online too. I know at least one of them is on my YouTube. Are you going to post this talk online too?
yes, yes.
Perfect. Cool. Love it. That's great. So people can come back and watch this at a later
Mhm.
date. Actually, there's a little. Oh, oh, oh. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So an ascospore. is this little fundamental unit of like kind of a needle shaped what's called an ascus. But the ascus is loaded up with spores. And what happens in a cup fungi is the whole sort of the cup's like this, and the whole surface of that cup is covered in lots of those little asci, all lined up together along the surface of the cup. And they are pressure sensitive. So they are primed and ready for if there's a puff of wind that they are going to build up a concentration of, I think it's like calcium oxalate, but basically they build up some minerals in the base of the ascus. And like it says on MycoWeb, and I think Britt Bunyard talks about this in his new book, The Lives of Fungi. It's like a squirt gun going off. You've created enough pressure that once the wind has gone by, the calcium oxalate builds up and it goes and squirts those spores out into the air column. And then the idea is that the wind is going to carry them off. And when they squirt out, they're going like insanely fast. It's like as fast as like a rocket blasting out of outer space for just like a microsecond to really propel them. And again, it's one of these crazy things. There's just like insanely tiny, infinitesimally small thing that generates a massive amount of force just to propel this out of the cup. And then, the wind takes it off kind of thing. In terms of why it makes that hissing, whooshing noise, I have no idea. And I didn't even know about it until I made some videos of me. If you find one of those cup fungi, you can blow on it. And
Mm-hmm.
about 2 to 3 seconds later, it'll go whoosh and create the spores. But when I turned up the sound, I could suddenly start to hear that noise. And I was like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
what makes
Mm-hmm.
that noise? I
Yeah.
don't know, but maybe
Yeah.
something related to that calcium oxalate buildup, and maybe
Yeah.
the sound of all of those things, bursting at
The
once maybe makes a little
friction.
whoosh. Cool.
Just, yeah, I know they have very large spores comparatively to other cup fungi, and especially the ones, because I believe there's 15 documented Ascomycetes fungi that do make an audible sound, to audible
Almost
to
every
human ears.
yeah,
I'm sure
almost
they're
every
animal.
single cup fungi that I've recorded makes noise when it throws the spores out. So
Yeah, so that would be a fun area of science, just to study the sound of spore dispersal.
yeah,
You
totally. Yeah,
could,
get some really super sensitive microphones and record all sorts of
mhm,
different things.
make music with it.
Well, you've seen me. I do a lot of mushroom tapping just for
Yeah.
fun mostly, but
Gonna have some more percussion sections. um, so let's see. Jody asks, can you speak more on the promising future uses of fungi?
yeah, I mean, it's the future is sort of unlimited for how much mushrooms can help us, and not just mushrooms, but fungi as a whole. And I really don't like the phrase mushrooms are going to save the world because I think that is far too reductive. And also, it puts us in the mindset that fungi should be doing something for us rather than
Mhm.
us going, we kind of screwed up the entire world. Maybe we need to, like, basically the world was in balance. Humans came along and massively unbalanced the world. Now we are seeing all of these like spread of diseases and other things happening because we've unbalanced the world. And the idea that fungi should somehow help us fix this unbalance is stupid. That's what I call the human hubris, right? We think we can do everything better. We think we know better than nature, so we create systems that are totally out of whack, out of balance, and then we're like, wait, why is there disease everywhere? So I think what we need to like retool our ideas and do is to shift our thinking to think about how can we put our fingers back on the scale to help rebalance things, and how can we understand the role of fungi within ecosystems to enable fungi to help us set the table and rebalance ecosystems without it having completely out of control. And so on like a micro scale, that can be as simple as like, hey, maybe just don't rake the leaves in your yard. Maybe just let them decompose and let the mycelium grow. Maybe don't trim all of the lower branches on your tree so there's a little microhabitat for the mushrooms to grow underneath that tree, and let that soil just be what it is because it's already evolved to do what it's supposed to be doing. But humans think that we do everything better, so we're going to do it our way. Maybe just let go of that and let nature be nature. That being said, there's also ways in which we can help manage and help nature do better, and that's stuff like doing controlled burns and looking at indigenous and native practices and ways that sort of sustainable food forests were maintained for millennia, instead of just letting nature be nature, because things are already so imbalanced that they're not going to go back to the way they were unless we help things out a little bit. And that's our process in trying to empathize, understand fungi, and work with them rather than constantly working against them. In terms of future directions, I think there's enormous potential for fungi as food. And if you look at fungi as food, you also have to contemplate that basically food is medicine, and that by eating more mushrooms, we could affect really positive change. One of the things I always say is like just eat more mushrooms. But if everyone took the amount of meat they ate, and I like meat, I'm an omnivore, I eat everything. But if you, instead of cooking up like 2 pounds of ground beef and pouring out all the fat, why don't you cook up 1 pound of ground beef and like a pound and a half of mushrooms, and let that mushroom, absorb the fat, so you're getting all of the nutrition that you paid for. And we force cows in these feedlots and fatten them up, and then we ditch all the fat after they've been fattened up. And again, it just mind blowing to me that we waste so much food, so much nutrition constantly. And fungi are a really great way, mushrooms in particular, are a great way to help supplement our diets with a lot more fiber, and really important, like prebiotic fiber that helps our, reduce inflammation in our guts and increase immune function. And if you think about the human diet, the thing we're missing, especially the American Western diet, we're missing fiber more than anything else. And so you don't need to eat mushrooms at every meal, but I don't think it'd be a bad thing if you did. And
Mm-hmm.
that being said, I do not like the mushrooms I get at a grocery store. I don't like button mushrooms. I do not like portobellos. I don't think they taste great. And sometimes they're okay, but most of the time they're a little too strongly flavored for me. And so getting access to a lot of different types of mushrooms is part of how you eat a lot more different kinds. That's what I was talking about, the value of eating stuff like lion's mane, shiitake, oyster mushrooms. There's a huge, broad variety of delicious mushrooms you can find either through foraging or by going to like Asian grocery stores and buying a lot of the stuff that's been cultivated. Maitake Griffla frondosa is another really delicious one that you can eat all the time. And just adding more mushrooms to your diet will help you be healthier, potentially drop weight. We would see big decreases in diabetes, obesity, et cetera, if people just ate more mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big one. There's the sustainability aspect too, of producing mycoprotein as sort of like a filler for stuff like chicken nuggets and taco meat, somewhere where the meat is sort of less important. It's more just about the texture and the flavors that go into something. There's tremendous potential for fungi to help us make materials. And I was talking about micromaterials of fiber, leather alternatives, building materials, shipping stuff. You can make all sorts of like actual chemical medicines. So there's, I didn't touch on it, but cancer drugs can be produced from fungi, and a lot of like statins, the things that we use to control high blood pressure, that's derived from fungi. Cyclosporin, which is really important immune suppressor, is actually a thing from Tolypocladium fungi that has been isolated, and we use that when we give people organ transplants. They take cyclosporin to repress the immune system so they don't reject the organ. And there's even the idea of bioremediation. And we can put like a cocktail of fungi into an environment and have them clean up like something like an oil spill. But that is something that isn't really well understood, well
Mm-hmm.
defined. And what I worry about is, especially with plastics, there's like over 500 types of fungi that have been shown to be able to eat plastics. But what they're doing is they're just going in the environment and testing plastics to see what's breaking them down. And they're finding that fungi can break down plastics, which isn't surprising because fungi are keyed in to digest complex carbon like plastics. But the problem is a lot of fungi are really just making more microplastics because they're not digesting it down into like reusable stuff. They're breaking it down into its components. And a lot of those components, those microplastic components, happen to be like free radical, carcinogenic, cancer causing stuff. So when I look at the plastic epidemic that we have around the world, I am afraid that fungi might actually be making things worse before they make them better. And I think there is the idea that like if we could take plastics and send them to a central location and maybe have fungi do the first step of the breakdown and then have like, bacteria and some archaea, we have like a biodigester. We could probably turn plastics back into like usable biomaterial. But what's happening out in nature right now is fungi are just having a free for all on plastics and producing more and more microplastics, which is really scary to me. And so not everything about fungi is necessarily good. There's a lot of disease causing things. There's a lot of things that like may not be in balance with our ecosystems, but that's where we need to better understand their roles and understand how we could help them do better rather than just assuming the ways they can help us.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So, kind of on the same topic, And I'm sure you get a lot of people sending you these like viral sort of news and tech specific innovations around fungi. So one that a bunch of people kept sending me the other day, and kind of knowing uh, the way that armillaria works, I was like, wait a minute, that's a decomposer fungi. How are they going to like introduce? So the story was scientists have developed glow in the dark wood using fungi that could illuminate streets and parks naturally. And so I went back to this article during your talk, and of course, like Alan Rockefeller is the highest ranked comet in the comet section, but the sort of idea is that they're introducing this pathogenic fungi onto these live trees, and the mycelium, since it's bioluminescent, it's going to illuminate the trees. I mean, it was just out there.
Yeah, that's a bad idea. Armillaria are known as meadow makers because they literally mow down trees. Um, they're extremely powerful plant pathogens, and I would not. They're one of the few mushrooms that I'm actually careful that to like not spread around because I don't want to infect. If you have a tree in your yard that's dying from armillaria, people are always like, "What can I do?" I'm like, pretty much nothing. You have to let all the trees die and wait several years for the armillaria to like leave your soil, and the spores are still going to be there. Um, I think Panella stypticus is one that is less aggressive and also has significantly brighter bioluminescence. So I know that that was one like back in the day when they were doing like early submarine research. I think the periscope actually used Panella stypticus as a light source, and so that is more viable. But yeah, anyone suggesting that we should spread armillaria around clearly has zero understanding of fungal biology or ecology. That is a very
Yeah.
irresponsible thing to suggest.
Yes. Yeah. And it was apparently like balsa wood. I don't know.
I
But
mean, again, people know so little about mushrooms and fungi that they hear one thing like that, and like news stories like proliferate because
mhm,
AI is writing articles, stuff, other stuff, and so you
mhm,
see these waves of stuff go through society, and there's not that many sort of fungal educators out there. So there's like me, there's Alan, and there's Paul Stamets, but Paul has a tendency to sort of like blow up those stories without actually looking at
mhm.
the facts critically. And so he makes stuff worse sometimes by like broadcasting and platforming things that aren't actually worthwhile or aren't scientifically viable. Um,
Yes.
Even the idea that like mushrooms are from outer space, they aren't. Fungi evolved here on this planet. We have a great molecular clock record for this, but he keeps saying they're from outer space, so everyone thinks they're from outer space, and that
Maybe
is
they're
also
from
problematic.
inside the earth. Maybe inside the earth. Coming up from the volcanoes. Yeah, I that's one area, the evolution of fungi, especially like the brown rot and white rot. I've dug into some of the rabbit holes online where there's people that say, after, there was such a change and there were so
Hmm.
many new white rot fungi like evolving after the Jurassic event. Like
Hmm.
there's a lot of people that think like maybe some new things like came in on that meteor, like perhaps, but the chemistry of our planet was like so shifted during that
Hmm.
event because it was such a catastrophic event. So it's hard to know, and I don't know how much it. I don't think molecular clock is all that is the only thing that can tell us the story. Perhaps.
But I mean, there's a lot of great evidence from looking at the way that things have sort of shifted over periods of time that
Mhm.
we're able to trace things back. We can't necessarily trace them back through the fossil record the same way for fungi, and that does complicate things because fungi inherently don't preserve the way that animal bones do.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
we lack a lot of the fossil evidence, but we do have really good genetic evidence if you look at like the progression from stuff of chytrids into zygomycetes fungi and et cetera, like all up along the line there. I have some great resources in the book that are cited. And the other thing I did in the book was a lot of stuff has a QR code. So there's figures that maybe you can't see the whole thing, or like every single mushroom entry has a thing where you can pull your phone out and it will direct you to a link, which gives you a lot more background on the information presented in the book. So that's a way that I'm hoping people will like use this book as a working resource to help them learn about the world of fungi.
nice. Yay. Well, are there any other questions? Lots of good thank yous. Did I miss anyone's questions? And feel free to unmute if you want to ask over the Zoom.
I'm here. I'm looking at my parents who are still on here, and I know that they're like 3 or 4 hours ahead right now. So thank you, parents, for tuning in and listening.
Oh, so sweet. Oh, that's cool. Well, I guess we'll say good night. Thanks everybody for tuning in and learning about fungi with us tonight. And we'll hope to see everyone at some upcoming events. And follow Fascinated by Fungi. He's always got great info. Get that book, pre-order.
Yep. And if you liked hearing me talk about mushrooms and fungi, I also have a podcast and YouTube. You can go listen to hours more of me talking about stuff and cooking. I do a lot of mushroom cooking.
Yes. Lots of ASMR content.
Lots of different stuff, different strokes for different folks, you know?
All right, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.